It's quite safe to say that, with regard to film, genre is a term not unfamiliar to most people. We all know that there are rough ways of categorising films with similar aspects, things like plot, settings, themes, music, characters, etc., and importantly, how the audience tends to respond to them. Certain genres are built around certain emotions that we, as indulgent pleasure-seeking creatures, naturally enjoy experiencing. Laughing at a comedy, feeling warm at a romance, and being in awe at an action-packed blockbuster. Other genres, however, sit in a grey area, genres that have a certain appeal at the cost of maybe eliciting more undesirable emotions. Genres like the drama, the thriller, the disaster, and specifically, in this case, the horror film. Given our general dislike towards and avoidance of both fear and disgust in the real world, founded in natural biological responses that have steered us away from danger for thousands of years, it certainly strikes us strange that, despite being fully aware of how it will make them feel, audiences continue to actively seek out these emotions within film. A genre that is, by nature and by design, repulsive, is not only attractive, but stupidly popular. It is a puzzle of both film and art philosophy generally that is easy to spot, but frequently proves frustrating to solve. In 1990, theorist Noel Carroll published The Philosophy of Horror, or Paradoxes of the Heart, a detailed examination of the aesthetics of horror fiction which, in the decades since, has become one of the highest authorities on the subject and, specifically, the paradox of horror. You'd be hard-pressed to find a breakdown of the paradox post-1990 which doesn't refer to him and his ideas. Carroll's book was and remains unique in that it deconstructs the paradox with incredible thoroughness, forming a distinct solution after both addressing and contesting other past solutions proposed as far back as ancient Greece, when Plato and Aristotle were wrestling with how the relatively new tragedy play was so popular, given its distressing contents. Naturally, a major influence for Carroll's answer, as well as many others, is this much older paradox of tragedy, in addition to what is referred to as the paradox of fiction, another aesthetic problem which questions how works of art can be emotionally evocative at all, given the fact that they aren't real or based upon anything real.
I'm not real enough for you!
These paradoxes are rabbit holes in their own right though, and so before we get lost down them, we should turn back to Carroll and his approach to the paradox of horror, what I'm going to call hedonic compensatory theory. Despite the fear and disgust it may evoke, the horror genre is no doubt a curious pool of strange, unknowable, sometimes impossible creatures, people and places that are hard not to be at least a little bit fascinated by. It is this unavoidable curiosity that serves as the core of Carroll's theory. He says in his book, "The objects of art horror are by definition impure. This is to be understood in terms of their being anomalous, and obviously the anomalous nature of these beings is what makes them disturbing, distressing, and disgusting. However, anomalies are also interesting. The very fact that they are anomalies fascinates us. Their deviation from the paradigms of our classificatory scheme captures our attention immediately. It holds us spellbound. It commands and retains our attention. It is an attracting force." The theory then asserts that the pleasurable aspects of horror, according to Carroll, that is, making one curious and then satisfying said curiosity, balances and often outweighs any associated negative emotion that is caused. Any discomfort is merely collateral damage, while our fascination with these strange, unknowable creatures, people and places is our hedonic compensation. This compensation is then enhanced by particular imagery and the structures of plot disclosure, a narrative that feeds us little tidbits of information to hold our curiosity and our attention for as long as possible. Certainly, horror of recent years has toyed with this link between fear and fascination. Successful examples include films like Cloverfield, The Babadook and It Follows, in which the monster is very rarely seen. This purposeful lack of information leaves an audience teetering on a knife edge, terrified but eager to see and hopefully know more about the monster by the end. And for Carol, it is this sustained curiosity, this want to understand, that makes the genre ultimately appealing. Now, Carol's theory certainly makes sense, but I wonder, for a theory that claims to be applicable universally, that it isn't under-inclusive. For one, many monsters of horror fiction are certainly weird and wonderful, beyond our limits of knowledge and spurring curiosity, but many aren't, at least not to the extent Carol advocates. Take Norman Bates in Psycho, Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, or Annie Wilkes in Misery. 3 popular horror films, 3 very popular examples of the psychopath, human monsters if you will, but none of them are anything you might consider supernatural. If Bates, Lecter and Wilkes are realist monsters then, how we go about defining a horror film becomes a muddier affair. A frightening villain with evil, murderous intent is no longer enough. I think we can agree that characters like Omen Girth and Darth Vader don't automatically make either Schindler's List or Star Wars horror films. The core issue with Carol's theory though is that it focuses too much on cognitive pleasure, in that it overcomplicates the nature of enjoyment. There is little real engagement with actual emotions and the unique bodily responses to horror that have been psychologically proven to be the reason as to why most audiences enjoy the genre. Sadly for Carol, this then complicates the coexistentialist part of his theory, as coexistentialism assumes that pleasure and fear are distinct, separate emotions that operate individually. Pleasure and fear then cannot be unitary to the coexistentialist. Fear is an intrinsically unpleasant emotion that is a necessary evil to endure should we desire pleasure from horror. What then of these countless audiences that claim to enjoy negative feelings for what they are? Carol believes they're mistaken.
Oh yes, anything's possible.
Carol's theory is by no means worthless. Quite the opposite in fact, but perhaps it just misunderstands the relationship between pleasure and pain. The opposite to the coexistentialist approach then is the integrationist approach, which assumes that emotions like fear and sadness are compound and can sometimes be attractive in their own right. Susan Fagan sits in this camp, and her approach to the paradox actually builds off a suggestion made by Carol that some of the pleasure of horror comes from a meta-response known as the macho rite of passage, the satisfaction one gets from proving to oneself and others that they can deal with high amounts of fear and disgust. It's a rare but not unheard of phenomenon, most apparent in adolescent males. Much like riding a roller coaster or eating a chili pepper, the horror film for these usually insecure people is a form of endurance test that proves their worth. Fagan is drawn to this idea of meta-pleasure, and while she respects Carol's macho rite of passage, she goes on to identify 3 different meta-pleasures audiences may experience in response to horror fiction, particular responses that she believes are more plausible and innocuous in understanding horror's unique appeal. They are: 1. The pleasure of being able to be scared and vulnerable, thus being proud that one is sensitive and empathetic enough to have such reactions. Wow. It's films like these that remind me I'm not a cold, emotionless husk. 2. The pleasure of actually being able to enjoy horror when to many people the genre is nothing but painful and tasteless. How the hell can you even like this stuff? It's an acquired taste. Not that you would know. 3. The pleasure in knowing that in experiencing horror, one will grow into a braver, more resilient person. I mean, I'm obviously more bold and daring if I can get through this and you can't. That's not true. Yes it is. No it isn't. Yes it is. No it isn't. Speaking as a horror fan myself, at this point it would be worrying if I said that I wasn't. These points pick out the uniqueness of horror, what it means to be a fan of the genre, and they've all crossed my mind at some point or another. But that's just it. They've crossed my mind. Briefly. Fagan seems to be missing the obvious problem here, in that meta-responses, while not unfamiliar, are uncommon, minute realisations that have little to no effect on someone's immediate enjoyment of being scared or even just being grossed out. For those who enjoy horror for those very reasons then, it seems hard to claim that their pleasure comes from something beyond the initial reaction. My enjoyment comes from being scared, not from scrutinising my reaction after the fact. John Morrell is another advocate of the integrationist perspective, arguing that the excitement we feel in fear is what makes fear potentially enjoyable, referring specifically to the unique physiological changes that fear brings about: an increase in sweating, muscle tension, heart rate, increased alertness, and so on. Fair enough, John, but why then fiction? Why do people seeking these sensations look for them in fiction, specifically horror fiction, rather than in real life, which, under the right circumstances, can surely evoke these feelings and sensations more fully and authentically? To answer this, we need to look for the appeal of fiction over reality, and of course, for Morrell, this lies in the element of control. Control theory suggests that fear is most enjoyable when there is acceptable risk, a balance between safety and danger, a balance that is best maintained by an individual's own control. High-stakes gambling, for example, can only create such extreme levels of both excitement at winning and fear of losing in its players if it is just that, high stakes. Without the risk of substantial loss or chance of substantial gain, any potential enjoyment is sacrificed to the pushing around of a few measly chips. As Morrell summarises, there is no adventure in penny poker. The appeal of the horror film, then, for those seeking out a mitigated sense of fear, what some call pseudo or quasi-fear, is twofold. 1. The film is fictional and therefore has no practical consequences for the viewer, making it safe. And 2. The film is optional, in that the experience can be stopped at any point, leaving the room, plugging your ears, covering your eyes, also making it safe. Of course, audiences still gain from horror, but only so far as the boundaries of both the film and those set by themselves will allow them to gain. This varies from person to person, and so might explain why some horror fans are more extreme than others. They're willing to lose more control. This, in turn, corresponds to the assumption that horror films which aim to curb the fictionality, those that seem as if they're real, are more extreme than those that don't. It is no surprise then that the found footage format is associated with horror, revived in the 90s and noughties by films like The Blair Witch Project, Paranormal Activity and, once again, Cloverfield. Of course, these films don't actually remove control from the viewer, but rather their raw cinematography, naturalistic acting and convincing marketing campaigns all give the impression of it. They encourage you to be genuinely scared by real events, rather than just quasi-scared by fiction. For most horror films, though, the audience can be somewhat content in knowing that, with certain controls at their disposal, they can experience a Goldilocks just right amount of fear and the relevant thrill that accompanies it.
I'm not going back in there.
Control theory, however, seems to act better as a supplement to the paradox of horror rather than an answer in and of itself. While numerous psychological studies offer at least partial support to Morrell's theory in that perceived control can help alleviate pain, Morrell makes a further mistake in his assertion that control is what actually allows us to enjoy negative emotions rather than just tolerate them. This seems to suggest that merely having control can help miraculously turn something that would otherwise be painful into something pleasurable, which is a view that can't really be defended. Being able to tell the dentist when to stop drilling might make the drilling more tolerable, sure, because it's on your terms, but it doesn't make the drilling actually enjoyable. While Morrell's reasoning as to why horror fiction is preferable over horror reality is pretty bulletproof then, the important question of motivation still remains: why people choose to enjoy and engage with horror fiction in the first place. Many theorists, including Carroll, at least initially, lean towards a psychological explanation, answering the motivational question by utilising Freudian ideas of repression and wish fulfillment. In this approach, horror is both attractive and repellent because the genre assists in manifesting and satisfying wishes that would otherwise never be acknowledged publicly. Ernest Jones, a friend of Freud, focuses on sexual wishes specifically in his text On the Nightmare, but the psychoanalytical approach can be made more viable if we extend this to general anxieties, repressed violence, and even infantile fantasies. As an example, Jones explains the appeal of the vampire, explaining that its intimate, seductive, and in myth, incestuous side is countered by a dark, horrifying, violent side, which is a means to camouflage the maybe embarrassing psychosexual gratification one might get from witnessing vampiric behaviour. The same might be said for the success of Stephen King's telekinetic teenager Carrie, who realises the act of revenge and omnipotence, and for the graphic Saw franchise, which realises internalised impulses of brutality.
Do you like how brutality feels, Mark?
Art is an expression of the human condition, and so it isn't surprising that horror specifically has been seen as an outlet for people to explore our morally questionable thoughts and feelings. King himself once wrote that horror is appealing because the potential lyncher is in almost all of us. As most of us can imagine though, this idea of wanting to fulfil dark internal wishes is still not comprehensive enough as an idea. Many objects of horror fiction just aren't symbolic of repressed wishes or anxieties. Things then become trickier when we consider more taboo examples like Saw with regards to appropriateness and morality. Audiences that went to go and see Saw and its numerous sequels probably weren't in denial, nor did they feel much guilt or embarrassment at going to the cinema to pay and see fictionalised torture. It's not that these people don't have dark and violent thoughts, but if there's any kind of sadism here, then it's shameless. Even I don't mind admitting that I like the Saw films. Why? Well, for one, they're quite captivating, they're repulsive, they have a strong story, for the most part, but they're so offensive and outlandish that it's hard not to hold a little bit of admiration for them. The point though is that there's no disguised wish fulfillment here. I think I speak for both myself and many other people when we say that we like Saw and similar works of horror fiction for reasons other than being a way to gratify internal violent impulses. Now, I would entertain some ahedonic approaches to the paradox, but I believe a solution that denies pleasure's role in the enjoyment of horror entirely makes it untenable. One ahedonic approach worth noting though comes from Aaron Smuts, what he dubs rich experience theory, asserting that we are seldom as fully engaged intellectually, perceptually and effectively as when experiencing painful emotional responses to art. People want to experience strong emotional reactions that art can produce, emotional reactions that are intrinsically unpleasant but nonetheless perfectly desirable, perhaps out of intrigue, out of necessity, or even because it's better than feeling nothing at all. While he, I think rightly, uses morale's control theory to suggest why we seek these emotions in art as opposed to reality, I don't believe Smuts' approach applies equally to all forms of painful art, particularly when we consider the communal experience that horror usually promotes. A total rejection of motivational hedonism flies in the face of the millions who choose to see a horror film over something with a more obvious positive effect, like a comedy, those who experience horror in their free time as a means of entertainment, more often than not with their friends in tow. By no means is pleasure the sole motivator for audiences that seek horror, but it is usually one of them in some way, shape or form, and so to deny its significance in the paradox, I believe, is a mistake. What then of a definitive answer to the paradox? Well, I hope I won't be bursting too many bubbles when I sit here and tell you that, like with most philosophical dilemmas, there really isn't one. All of the theorists who have offered their 2 pennies worth on the paradox know this, of course, as do I, but I suppose the point of me sitting here talking to you in a dark, candlelit room with quite frankly hot and hideous dressing gown wasn't really to settle on anything concrete in the end. A paradox is only really solvable when one interprets one of the 2 contradictory elements in a very specific way. If someone doesn't agree with your interpretation, which in this world is quite likely, all it takes is another scholar to come along, tell you to stick it, and make you question your life's work all over again. No. The existence of horror, or rather the existence of the paradox, all of the different rational approaches to it, and all of the ways in which these approaches have made us see horror differently over the years, the way it speaks to us differently, that is the solution. It can sometimes be impossible to fully express our internal feelings. Even this film could be an example of that difficulty. Despite sharing my thoughts on the paradox of horror, I've failed to provide my own approach to it in the end. But that's just it. Horror is, like all other forms of art, subjective, and so trying to remove that subjectivity with a universal, comprehensive answer as to why people are attracted to something as repulsive, abstract and personal as horror is to reject the beauty of individual experience, including mine. My opinions on the approaches addressed here are just that, opinions, and if anything, diving into the academia has brought me closer to understanding not why we like horror, but why I like horror. Carroll may focus on fascination, Fagan on meta-responses, morale and control, Jones on repression and Smuts on rich experience, etc. But in my examination and evaluation of these varying solutions, I can only admit to have come to one conclusion. Every one of them is valid. Each one comes from a different angle, a new and interesting perspective, and while some may, perhaps wrongly, try and confine the horror experience to some kind of objectivity more than others, they all show just how intimate and ever-changing the genre is, an evolution that reflects both our internal selves and the external, evolving world around us.
It seems to me that it touches very deep areas of the human personality.
Horror shamelessly crosses boundaries and transcends assumptions. It is timeless, it is interstitial, it is meaningful, and while an answer to the paradox of horror cannot be universal, horror itself most certainly is. Why then am I attracted to horror if it is repulsive? Because it's more than being just repulsive. Far, far more.